Thanks, Kate. It's good to see some familiar faces on the call. We've had a few conversations with housing associations and local authorities so far about kind of the alignment between a no interest loan scheme and the financial well-being needs of both customers of housing associations, so tenants, and also local authority residents. And we've heard that there's quite a lot of crossover between the kinds of customers who might get support through a financial resilience program out of a housing association, or a debt advice program out of a housing association, or say a local resident that gets into financial hardship and contacts a council for kind of support, and the customers that Fairfield Finance targets broadly, and those that we target with NIL specifically. And what we're thinking with the no interest loan scheme is that really we see out there kind of gaps in financial services provision for customers in this target group, where there's various kind of numbers going around, but 24 million people potentially with characteristics of vulnerability. The number's not on here, but I know through the FCA that they say there's kind of 14 million people with low financial resilience, and for those people, that there's a lack of access to financial products and services which can put them on a pathway to financial resilience, and that's what we intend to do with the no interest loan scheme. Is put something in place where, through a small amount of credit, so we're talking £500 to £1,000, say, a customer can kind of meet their short-term kind of needs, expenses. Perhaps that's kind of partially a rent payment, perhaps it's an essential purchase, perhaps it's kind of September time when kids are going back to school and needs are higher, perhaps it's around Christmas, but that short-term cash impetus will enable the customer to be more financially secure over a longer period of time. So that's kind of the customer need, and I guess the customer hypothesis as we come into this. So Fairfield Finance, as you might have realised at this point, have been kind of commissioned through the Treasury, and it's part of our mission to kind of try and make something around this work and test a couple of hypotheses around whether a no interest loan scheme will actually kind of have the benefit that we're talking about for customers and will work in practice. So we want to see that there is demand for this among customers, and we want to see also in terms of delivery that there is a positive customer outcome which is greater than the cost of the scheme. And because we're talking about a no interest loan, clearly an amount of subsidy is required, and we need to put quite a lot of funding in. So we need to make sure that business case ties up on that kind of customer benefit being greater than that funding, and the hypothesis is that that's very much the case, but it's something that we'll be looking to prove through this pilot. And lastly, just to point to the fact that we're looking to build a sustainable permanent solution for NILs in the UK. So we think it would be great if customers in vulnerable circumstances had this as an option when they're in greater difficulty to kind of get them on that more secure financial pathway. So longer term, we'll be looking to do this kind of with partners and thinking about what a long-term pitch could look like. I won't repeat the kind of objectives because they really do tie into the hypotheses where we'll want to kind of work to prove that those things that we've identified there. Cool. I think that's it for those slides. And is it, Kate, back to you on the kind of delivery structure that we're looking towards?
Thanks, Tom. So to deliver the pilot, we're partnering with Toynbee Hall and Fair by Design, and together we'll be essentially running the pilot as a central function. Toynbee Hall are working very closely with us to structure the evaluation, both process and impact evaluation during and after the pilot, and Fair by Design are working very closely with us on getting the product settings and that product design really right for this customer group. With backing from Treasury, we've been able to ensure that the pilot covers the whole of the UK. So we're intending to appoint lenders to deliver the pilot in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and in 3 sites in England. And just to give you a sense of scale, we're hoping that those sites will deliver about 3,000 loans per location. That volume is quite dependent on obviously the pricing that we get back in the bid process, and also contributions from co-funders and so forth. But our plans are really to embed this in a way that integrates very closely with local agencies, thinking in particular about your good selves, because we think it's really vital that we've got housing associations and local authorities involved in this for the reasons that Tom's just set out. And there's quite a lot of international evidence about NILs working most effectively when those relationships are working really well. So the intention is that we've got referral routes from those local agencies coming into community lenders, and that those lenders are working directly with people in vulnerable circumstances who would benefit from a NILS loan, and that in the course of that loan, that borrower is able to help improve their financial resilience, potentially build up a better credit history, and potentially form a longer term relationship with that lender. I'm conscious that a number of credit unions and CDFIs offer both loans and savings solutions in terms of engagement with other providers to help build the resilience of those borrowers over time. So that's a little bit about the structure of the pilot. I'm just going to move on to talk a little bit about what we want to test. And this relates quite closely to the hypotheses that Tom has set out. But essentially, we've put together a reasonably broad list of the reasons that we think exist for the loans to be offered. And part of what we're trying to do at the moment is to refine thinking on that. So we really welcome thoughts and views on those reasons for loans. But the intention is that there's then, in effect, two customer eligibility routes into the NILS pilot. One is where a lender would otherwise have to decline a borrower because the loan itself is unaffordable when the interest is added. And this premise is a really central one out of the feasibility study which London Economics completed for Treasury a few years back. Essentially, the thinking there is that there are a number of people for whom a loan is not affordable if interest is included, but who could afford to repay the principal if that interest was taken away. And it's that premise which is also in place in, for example, the scheme in Australia, which has been running for about 40 years. The second customer eligibility route that we're looking at is where the borrower did not meet the lender's criteria. And that might be because there is a challenge in terms of their credit worthiness. Perhaps they have a thin file or one that's got some adverse marks on it. But we think that there is a number of borrowers for whom their circumstances historically are not necessarily the circumstances that should be determining their availability of lending going forward. So we're trying to set NILS up to really give lenders an opportunity to work with those borrowers where the criteria in terms of their ability to pay in the future is not really accurately reflected in their credit file historically. As Tom mentioned, the core product, we're anticipating that the average loan will be about £500 over a 1 year period. We've got some flexibility about the range. So we could go as low as £100, we could go as high as £2,000. We're also interested in feedback on those kind of core loan settings. And the intention, as I said, is that we've got some really strong customer referral routes in from charities, housing associations, local authorities, and so forth. We think the DWP one is probably too big for the scale of pilot that I've mentioned, but if we can make NILS work on a larger scale in the future, then that's the sort of thing that we'd like to see incorporated. And I saw there was just a question in the chat about have we selected the sites. So basically the 6 locations that we're intending to pilot in are going to be selected as part of a procurement that will commence in November. And my colleague George is going to talk about that in due course. But we are essentially looking to appoint providers with co-funders and partners coming in alongside them, and the quality of the bids will determine the actual locations. In our full market engagement pack, we've got quite a lot of detail about our proposed criteria for assessing those, and you won't be surprised to find, I'm sure, that there is a strong emphasis in there about areas of deprivation and need. So that's a little bit about the solution that we want to test. And I think I'll just pass back to Tom to talk a little bit about who we want to deliver this with.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So there's kind of two key elements to it. Clearly, we're doing lending, and we'd like that to be done through existing lenders, because there's kind of really good local infrastructures and community lenders that can do this well, and know specifically how to target and serve this customer group that we want to kind of utilize as part of this. So we're thinking about credit unions to CDFIs really, and we know there's lots of good partnerships that exist already between both housing associations, local authorities, and the community finance sector. So we're kind of thinking about tapping into an existing local ecosystem. But if those partnerships don't exist already, we've got case studies that say they are really good and kind of meet customer needs, and that we hope that this can be a good way of kind of extending those partnerships, which can potentially go outside the no interest loan scheme too. So yeah, lenders are the kind of I guess the real kind of core operational part of this, and they'll be doing the kind of loan servicing, fulfillment, the main customer contact. But what we think is that referral partners such as yourselves could be really important to get the right customers into the scheme. And we want to kind of identify the customers who would benefit the most from the no interest loan scheme. So those who might be experiencing kind of financial hardship, might have a few debts and be on the edge in a few ways, might kind of be struggling to meet expenses, but who do have kind of that they don't have a budget deficit at this point. So at that point, we wouldn't be able to kind of offer them the loan. So it's kind of that spot between potentially going into difficulty and kind of being okay that we want to specifically target with this. So it's more of a kind of upstream type solution versus debt advice. But we're thinking about housing associations and local authorities specifically because of that alignment between your customers and what we're targeting here. And specifically for those two groups as partners, we would like both the referral mechanism to kind of refer into the scheme locally, but we're also seeking co-funding to deliver this. And the co-funding enables us to do more loans, essentially, and potentially go further on risk and customer groups. So yeah, that's what we'd really like to do, where we think an ideal bid into doing this in a place will contain both a lender and a referral partner that acts as a co-funder too. So we're seeking, we're kind of doing a bit of a mix and match between lenders and referral partners to make that work, because we know that all of the relationships aren't there right now. So that's something that we'll be looking to coordinate if there is interest, and that should help to do kind of joint bid writing when it comes to that as well. And if we jump to the next slide, yeah, we've done this out of some early conversations with organisations like yourselves again, where we've looked at both the kind of, I guess, the alignment on purpose between this and your activities, and I think the alignment on purpose needs to be really clear, and then also the kind of business case alignment, where actually supporting a customer a bit earlier on in their kind of journey and before that potential point of a more crisis situation with debt could be beneficial to an overall business case conversation when it comes to cost savings on kind of future rent arrears or bad debt, or the need for, say, other local welfare services in the local authority's case. So yeah, we do kind of need a bit of help to work this out further, but the hypotheses are that there is that business case there which threads through to kind of a reduction in cost for local agencies after the intervention. So overall, we're seeing a wider payoff, and then clearly there's that alignment there between poverty alleviation and helping customers in vulnerable circumstances and this scheme.
Great, Thanks, Tom. I'm just going to talk a little bit to kind of our approach to the pilot. So as kind of Kate mentioned, we're kind of kicking off this pilot with a kind of market engagement period. So we've been working kind of in the background on these plans, and this is kind of the point where we're bringing them to potential stakeholders and partners like yourselves to get kind of feedback on those kind of pilot designs. And yeah, that feedback's so crucial to kind of help us kind of co-design this scheme, and will be really essential for kind of refining the assumptions that we've made kind of to date. So kind of how does that work in practice? So I think Kate mentioned we've got a kind of market engagement pack, which is very, very detailed, which if you haven't seen, do let us know. You can email the programs inbox, and I'll put that email address into the chat. But we'll send you a copy of the market engagement pack if you haven't already seen it. And that kind of goes through all of the detail, the kind of current plans. So everything kind of from pricing and kind of procurement, and also to kind of the partnership process. It won't all be relevant to you. There are kind of lots of different sections with questions, and some are obviously kind of aimed at lenders and pricing. So don't feel that you need to kind of answer all of those sections. But in that market engagement pack, you'll find a link to an online form which has kind of questions, and you're able to submit feedback on the pilot design. We're looking for feedback on that by Monday, which I know is quite a short period between now and then. But as I say, I think probably not all of the questions will be necessarily kind of relevant to your organisation. So just feel free to kind of answer the ones that feel most relevant to you. We're also, I think, as Kate touched on, kind of procuring partners for this pilot. So once we've got the kind of market engagement feedback, we'll be kind of feeding that into the procurement process, and that'll be kicking off in kind of mid-November. We're looking for joint bids from lenders and from local agencies, as Tom just outlined. And I think the other thing just to flag on the kind of our approach is really the objective of this pilot is to test and learn whether a no interest loan scheme works for this customer group, and if it does work, in kind of what circumstances. So we're really trying to kind of work at this in a very kind of agile and iterative way. So really testing and learning and working with partners who are up for that testing and learning process. And that will really help us kind of build the case for a long-term and ongoing NILS that kind of can work on the larger scale. The other thing just to mention is we've got a proof of concept, which is a very small test NILS that we're kind of launching at the moment, and we'll be kind of feeding those learnings into the wider pilot. And part of that will be how those kind of partnerships and referrals work into the scheme. So I'm just going to quickly touch on the kind of pilot procurement structure as well. I think Kate mentioned that we're looking to run the pilot across all 4 nations of the UK. And we've structured the procurement hopefully to kind of be really flexible depending on kind of how your organisation is kind of structured. So the procurement is structured in lots, and there'll be 8 lots, and those lots cover each of the pilot locations in every nation. And then there's also a lot which bundles all the 3 English locations together, and another lot which bundles all the countries in one. So if your organisation has a kind of UK-wide remit, you could look to partner with a lender that also has a UK-wide remit and bid for all the pilot locations. So that's just a kind of explainer on how that kind of procurement structure works. But there's a lot more detail in the market engagement pack. And the final thing I just wanted to touch on was kind of timings. So as I mentioned, we're in the market engagement period at the moment, and we're looking for feedback on that market engagement pack by Monday. We'll then be kicking off our kind of issuing the invitation to tender for the procurement process in mid-November. And we've allowed kind of 2.5-3 months for that sort of tender process. So we'll be hoping for bids back at the end of January next year, and we'll be looking to appoint partners by April, and then have a couple of months to kind of set up a mobilisation, and aiming to get the first loans out in September 2022. So it's a bit of a process, and we're obviously managing public money for this pilot, so we're having to go through quite a kind of intensive procurement process, but hopefully the way we've kind of structured it, and the detail of that is all in the market engagement pack, means it's a very kind of open and transparent and hopefully straightforward process as well. So I think that's a kind of whiz-bang tour through those elements. I'm just going to pass back to Kate for kind of next steps.
Thanks, Georgia. So I think just the only other thing to mention is that we've been very conscious that procurement takes a long time. It takes time for us, takes time for yourselves and for the lenders. So what we're also doing with this procurement is setting the contracts up in such a way that they can be extended if more funding becomes available. So essentially, if we're able to prove through the pilot that NILS works, and we get additional funding for it to continue, then there shouldn't need to be a hiatus in the lending that we put in place. We're also planning to use the contracts that we award to the lenders to pilot other products. So I'm aware some of you will know more than others about Fair for All Finance, but we've got quite ambitious plans about the other kinds of products that we think are relevant to people in vulnerable circumstances. So through these contracts, we're also hoping to pilot things, for example, like consolidation loans, solutions for appliance poverty and others. So there's quite a broad set of criteria that we're looking at in the lender appointment process. And I just thought I'd mention that because I know that some of you are also very conscious about the need for alternative provision of similar products. So just to recap on the next steps, we've got the market engagement pack out. We're hoping for feedback by Monday. As Georgia mentioned, we're then going to release the invitation to tender in mid-November. We're expecting bids back in late January. And we're also conscious that some lenders are more fluent than others with how to put bids together. So we've got a bid preparation workshop coming up to help those that need it. And we're also very happy to help facilitate discussions with potential partners if it's helpful to be introduced to anyone that you think might be useful to connect with in terms of thinking about a potential bid. But I'm going to stop there and open the floor for questions. And thankfully, I think there are not so many of you that we have to do these all in a written context. So can I suggest that we just actually use the putting the hand up signal if people want to articulate a question. You're very welcome to write them in the chat if you prefer, but yeah, the floor is yours. Gemma, would you like to come in first?
Thank you, and thanks for summarising it. Today is the first time I've heard about it, so yeah, really good to have a summary. Thank you. I work for Optival Housing Association, so we operate over London, Sussex, Kent and the Midlands. Sounds an interesting proposition. I've just got a few questions if I can be cheeky. We are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority for two aspects. We're regulated to give money guidance, but we're also regulated in relation to our lending and interest-free lending, and that's around a whole other arm of the business that I'm not an area of expertise in for leaseholders. But that's where our license sits now. As soon as I heard about this, I was thinking, if we're recommending one product, where do we sit on that? And I take it you probably have scoped that out already, so I'd be interested to hear about that. We're not linked to any specific credit union at the moment. Because we operate over a large area, we've made the decision not to take on a common bond. Would that exclude us from any future behaviour? And then I noticed that one of our colleagues, April, mentioned in the chat about leaseholders struggling to pay major works. That's what I had jotted down as well for fire safety works. Some are facing huge bills that aren't going to tackle this, but potentially for lower bills. That's where my head went to. So that's everything if we're looking at potentially co-funding for that. So thank you.
Tom, would you like to come in?
Yeah, sure. I think when it gets into the regulatory area, the guys will come to me, so I'm happy to do that. And yeah, thanks, Gemma. I'm glad it was useful to hear the overview. On the regulatory side, we've specifically invited housing associations and local authorities into this because we know that on credit brokering, there's the FCA have done specific work to make it very easy for both sets of organisations to refer to a specific lender. So with housing associations, the FCA have an exemption to the credit brokering legislation, which has been agreed with the Treasury, which means that rather than applying for a specific credit brokering permission, which is like a really lengthy process, which you might not want to invest in, there's just quite a simple form that housing associations can kind of basically submit to the FCA to kind of get that exemption. So we've kind of scoped this quite carefully with them and mapped out the I guess permission structures. We know that some organisations on the call and others already have that exemption in place, so that becomes a bit easier. But we're assured by the FCA that it's not a lengthy process, and that if an organisation doesn't have that kind of exemption in place already, then the timelines for this would work to get that, basically. And they we work with them closely, and they're really supportive of this scheme. So hopefully that's not a barrier. Does that help on that first question?
Absolutely,
yeah,
because we've been through it with another agency having to ask for exemption, and it took significant length of time. So yeah, that's really helpful that it's a nice form that should be quite slick. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, was that another housing association that did that exemption? No.
Okay, no. Fine. It was a commercial business for recommendation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting area that this exemption came in, I think in about 2019, and it's one where I don't think the kind of dissemination of that information was as good as it could have been, and that there's still a perception that it's a really difficult process, but we are assured that it's easy, and we've got feedback from other housing associations that have done it too. So yeah, but if that does look like an issue, do let us know, because we think it's a good thing for housing and credit to link up generally. On your other bits, I think I captured the questions on the kind of common bond area. It's no kind of restriction coming into this to whether you have a common bond set up with a credit union or not. Basically, I think it would be difficult to get a common bond set up between yourselves and a credit union for the purpose of this pilot, but it could be that there's like an alignment between place such that, say, I don't know, a credit union somewhere in Birmingham has a good crossover with your housing stock, then that might be kind of sufficient to be able to do this without having the full common bond for that credit union and Optivo stock. So I think there's a way to do it, and also with CDFIs, they're not constrained by geography. So if you did partner with a CDFI, of which there are fewer, but a few very good ones, such as Moneyline and Fair for You, they'd be able to kind of serve customers across your stock. And then your last question on leaseholders, we've not actually thought about this before, but I feel like generally leaseholders will not sit within our definition of customers in particularly vulnerable circumstances, and it could be good to kind of take it offline and debate it a little bit. But yeah, I don't think we'd kind of had that crossover as kind of a potential customer use case based on kind of the loan sizes and where those kind of customers might be financially. So typically it's kind of much like lower income customers who kind of tend to be renters, but we don't know as much about you about that profile. So if you disagree, then we'd be really happy to kind of look at information about it. I hope that helps.
That was incredible. Yeah, you've answered everything I needed. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right, good memory test. There's a couple of questions in the chat too. Kate, I don't know if we want to come to them. Oh, we've covered the leaseholders one. There's one too about the areas of England and whether they've been announced. So no, they've not, and it's essentially going to be part of the procurement process. The decision on where those places are. So we're going to put within the procurement process some criteria on the fact that it needs to be an area of high need, and we'll look at that by things like IND score in the area, and then that need will form part of the assessment along with the kind of combination of local partners coming into the scheme. So the need's almost like a fundamental bit, and then if we get the partners in place to deliver in those areas, then that kind of ticks all the boxes. We didn't want to decide before because, well, I don't think that would be a good way to do it for a number of reasons, but I think it's good to cast the net quite wide because this is a really good opportunity for local places. And we've heard about some sets of organisations having good conversations about how this can be like something that can be a bit of a flagship project to kind of highlight, I guess, more centrally through the local government, and that it could be like a good way to spotlight the place. So we've sensed a little bit of kind of competitiveness on organisations looking at this, and I feel like that kind of generates some good bids, but also we don't want to rule any places out that we perhaps don't know the partners in through like an arbitrary process. So we've left it really open with that criteria in there that it must be a place of high need, and then we'll look at partners that come in on top of that. We don't have to do like raised hands if people just want to go off mute and shout. I think we've realised we've got a very polite group, so we're not going to get everyone at the same time.
Will you be looking at joining bids together? So if you had a number of bids from, say, well, Birmingham, to choose my area, would you be putting those together, or is it down to us to actually come together as a combined bid?
I'm happy to take that one, David. We're pretty much expecting the combining part to be largely with the organisations that are bidding, but we're really happy to help make introductions for those who perhaps don't have an existing connection with a lender that they think would be worth taking forward. As you can imagine, because it's a full and proper procurement through a tender route, our hands are going to be a bit tied once we start the procurement itself. But between now and the middle of November, we've got quite a lot of latitude to help kind of facilitate. So if you'd like to have a conversation offline about any introductions that you'd like us to make, or if there are some things that we can do to help your thinking about what a partnership might look like, we're really happy to do that. But as I said, it's a bit time limited because come November, when we're actually procuring, anyone who asks that kind of question will get an answer that we publish to everyone else, which is probably not ideal. So yeah, I hope that's all right. There might be some other questions that are already covered in our ever-growing log of frequently asked questions, so we can certainly share those with you as well, and also happy to take any after the call, obviously, but do sing out if there's anything else that comes to mind now.
We could also take comments rather than questions if you're inclined more in that basis, but yeah.
Can I ask? I'm from a local authority. This is the first I've obviously come along today, but I've not looked at the frequently asked questions. I'm not aware of the scheme previously. What sort of footprint are you thinking of? I mean, you know, I'm from a sort of middling size organisation. You know, would you be expecting, if local authorities were involved, would you be looking for a city region size application, or would it be down to the individual local authority area?
I think we're quite agnostic about that, Kate. The thing that's important in our criteria is the point that Tom mentioned earlier, that we're targeting this at places with areas of high deprivation. And from our perspective, that doesn't mean that the borrowers need to come from a neighbourhood pocket that's tiny, because we recognise that there's lots of diversity across the areas that encompass deprivation. So I think the thing that came up earlier in Gemma's question about the common bond that a credit union might have is one obvious kind of geographic thing to consider. But we've also been asked about whether we'd accept bids where more than one credit union is working together, so that geographic boundary is extended. And we're also expecting bids from community development finance institutions who tend not to have the same geographic constraint. So we're really being guided by the market, in effect, and what bidders, co-funders and referral partners think is going to make sense. I think one of the things that we're also quite conscious of is the extent to which the relationship with the borrower really drives the quality of the engagement and the extent to which bad debt's mitigated. And I was really interested in Lauren's comment in the chat about the scheme that is running in London, because I think our observation is that there's quite a good balance to be struck between an individual having a relationship with the borrower where that connection seems to have an influence on their propensity to repay. But obviously we want to make sure that the way that lending is done is also recognises that not everyone wants to have a face-to-face conversation every time they want to talk about their financial well-being. So there's a little bit of that nuance too in the kind of the geography and the channels that we're interested in.
Cool.
Hey, I had a question. It's Adam here from Hacked. I was just wondering about, like, because you said it's a pilot, right? So I was just wondering, like, how you will define whether the pilot has been a success, and also do you have, like, built into it an expectation that some people won't be able to pay the loans back even though they are no interest?
Tom, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So in terms of the success criteria, really it's about those hypotheses and testing those hypotheses. So we'll look at customer impact in detail and look at improvements in financial well-being of customers, but also improvements outside of their financial position. So things like improvement in mental health and potentially employability or child well-being, things like that we know are connected to kind of finances from other research and other impact reports. And it will be a balance of that versus the cost, essentially. And from a kind of government point of view, we need to make sure that benefit outweighs the cost, which I think is a sensible way of looking at it. So we'll be doing that assessment as we go and kind of talking to customers, doing interviews and surveys at the point of lending, and then perhaps a year later to do that assessment. So we'll be keeping an eye on it as we go. And what we hope is that if things come out that show it's not working so well quite early, we've got a kind of 2-year lending period, so we've got time to adapt perhaps the customer cohorts or the purposes for the loans to kind of make sure that it's having benefit. We do expect a default rate, to your second question on customers not paying back. That I think the default rate generally in affordable lending to these customer cohorts is perhaps around 15% right now, of those kind of loans that go into arrears. We expect it to be a little higher than that based on the fact that it's a no interest loan, and there might be a kind of behavioural element to that we've just not tested yet. Obviously, we'll do everything we can to kind of get that default rate down, and the lenders are pretty good at kind of collections and that operational side, but quite a big cost element is the default rate, basically. So we are planning for that.
Thanks very much.
And if anyone has questions too, that this could be in the chat about kind of local lenders that may be good partners potentially based on where you're located, then we can kind of handle that informally in the chat as well. We've got a pretty good kind of awareness of the different providers, but we know also there's good partnerships in place already, so it doesn't have to be through us at all. And again, we've heard examples of connections already being made between lenders and different local agencies, which are really positive outside of this. So we would encourage you guys to kind of make them as well if you think this is interesting. And then my other kind of thought on this is that obviously, you know, even on this call, there's 20 organizations who are potentially interested in this, but only 5 pilot areas. We don't want this to just exist through Fair4 Finance. So these kinds of lending products and also partnerships can be useful for customers regardless of us. So hopefully this is kind of some useful food for thought outside that too. I think I've spoken for about as long as anyone can bear without more questions. So perhaps we kind of take that as kind of towards the end of those urgent ones, Kate.
Thanks, Tom. I'm sure I'm meant to say something now about how we never tire of your dulcet tones, but I think I might have missed the moment there. Look, I think unless anyone has any more questions or comments, I suggest we give you all a little bit of time back in your day. I think we can circulate the links to the market engagement pack and the full questions and answers that we've already collated. I just want to say thank you again for making time to join us and for a really thought-provoking set of questions and comments. Really happy to speak with any of you offline if that's helpful, and hope that we can meet up in due course on either this or other products that we pilot in the future. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really interesting.